I am here to talk about hip-hop, the virtual machine, the need for speed, and the PHP Renaissance, hashtag PHP Renaissance. Who am I? I'm Josh. I've been doing Drupal for a long time, more than 10 years, and I've been recently showing up and doing stuff in the WordPress community as well, which has been wonderful. I'm a developer, systems guy, come from a background doing a lot of high performance and consulting type stuff, and now I founded and helped run this wonderful company called Pantheon that cares a lot about speed and scale. So this is firmly in my wheelhouse. And if you have related or orthogonal questions to any of this stuff, you can come bother me at my booth. Okay, so we're going to start this presentation by going back in time a little bit to around when I actually first got involved in the Drupal project. I really like the Nerd Summit being kind of like broadly about web development in general. The first event, community event that I went to was the Open Source CMS Summit in Vancouver, British Columbia in 2006. And I was so excited by what happened there and just seeing everybody come together and work that I ended up starting a company like 3 months later. And it was really the energy of that conference got me fired up. And then the next Open Source CMS Summit, which was in 2007, was at Yahoo's headquarters in when Yahoo was kind of a more snazzy company. And that was at the time they had just hired Rasmus, the guy who invented PHP, and all this stuff was happening. But under the covers, PHP was actually in a really bad state at that time. It was kind of a dark age. Basically, PHP came out of the idea of having something to help you script and make websites. And it's got a lot of eccentricities to it, and it's got some pretty cool features to it. But it got popular really fast, and it went from being a totally new thing in the very late 90s to being one of the most popular languages for doing the web, almost like within a span of just a few years. And it's not uncommon in open source projects that have a really big and very rapid rise in popularity for that to kind of screw up the community. And in the PHP project, circa 2007, was really after this big rise to fame had happened, and there was a lot of discord within the PHP community itself around where the project was going. There was a huge amount of legacy stuff from the PHP 4 era that basically people thought they would be saddled with forever. There were real questions around like where PHP 5 was headed. People were openly saying that there would be no PHP 6, that it was like basically this is the end of the road. This is a transitional thing. But like people were, and like there was just like it was real bad. Like people were going in at night and like reverting other people's changes, and like the stuff that like immature sort of failure of community stuff was happening. And it was bad. Like it was actually like for someone who was PHP went through this rise, and then and then it was like this, and then Drupal was starting to go way up, and I was a part of that, which was exciting. We were all really worried, like what's going to happen to PHP? Right? Are we going to have to retool in some other language if PHP totally just nosedives or like stops being supported? It was openly talked about. And again, there was a lot of challenges for PHP. There was the 4.x, all these low-end hosting companies were just like, no, we're not going to upgrade. We're not going to force people to upgrade. They like their website the way it is. We don't care that it's totally insecure. We don't care that it has problems that can't be fixed. It's just the way it is. Deal with it. And that was kind of like this huge legacy weight holding the entire project back. And then the tools that they actually had to work with were not really helping either. Like the kind of packaging system that PHP had in that era, the sort of pair PECL, was inspired by Perl's CPAN system, and Perl's CPAN system is really not something you would want to be inspired by. It's functional, it does what it's thing, but there's a reason why the Perl people call themselves the Perl monks, because it's like mystical stuff that's not very straightforward and requires a lot of arcania to operate. And yeah, it was just it was bad, right? And we weren't sure what was going to happen. And then things kind of turned around. And I give a huge amount of credit for that turnaround to Facebook, which a few years after that, this is more like maybe like 2009, 2010, they made an institutional decision to double down on PHP. Like Facebook is written in PHP, and they were thinking about whether they should abandon that or whatever, and they're growing very rapidly as a company, and like kind of retooling your product while you're growing very rapidly is not a good idea typically, unless there's like, because if you're growing, your product is working, and you just kind of want to keep it working and keep it scaling. And they were looking at this and kind of plotting it out and being like, okay, we're going to go and be a big company. We're going to go and be a big company that's dependent on a PHP application. We need to make PHP better. And they made an institutional commitment to do that in a way that was actually much more impactful than what Yahoo had done before, because they had supported some PHP projects. But Facebook really threw a lot of engineering talent into it rather than just putting some money into the PHP community. And we started to see these organizational tools get a lot better. We started to see the development of things like Composer, which has really changed the game in terms of how you manage dependencies and packages in PHP. You saw the rise of these sort of next-generation frameworks like Symfony and Laravel and these others that really, really improved things quite a lot. We started to see PHP make some hard decisions, like saying, okay, 4.0 is over. The 4.x line is dead, and if you can run it if you want, it's open source, but we don't support it. We're not going to maintain it. Get off of it. Upgrade. It's time. And that was a fraught decision. And internally, PHP started to improve quite a bit. Actually, between PHP 5.1, 5.2, and 5.3, it got quite a bit faster. It got quite a bit better. There are these internal improvements that were being made. We added namespaces in PHP 5.4. In PHP 5.5, there's an integrated opcode cache that replaces APC. And this is a performance-oriented talk, so I'll show the results of just going from PHP 5.3 to 5.5 sped things up dramatically. And all of these internal improvements came because people realized that PHP has a future. PHP is getting better. PHP can be a first-class language. PHP does run something like 40% of the web, and it should, it needs to continue to raise its game for the web to get better and better over time. It showed that competition is good because Facebook started putting out things like the hip-hop virtual machine was sort of like their major shot across the bow. But what it did was that also galvanized the existing PHP community. And now you have, as a legacy of all this stuff, PHP is actually skipping version 6 and will go from 5.x, whatever it is, to PHP 7. There will be no PHP 6. You heard it here first. Not here. You probably heard it on Twitter, but it's ironic, right? But the stuff for PHP 7, the PHP NG project, which is now rolling into PHP 7, is inspired by a lot of the stuff that hip-hop did, and having these alternate implementations is spurring people to really innovate and really do good things. So it's a new day in PHP development, I guess is what I'm saying. It's the most popular language on the web. It's getting better, and we are in the midst of the PHP renaissance, #PHP renaissance. So have some pride if you are a PHP developer, because it's a good time to be working in this language. There's a lot of exciting stuff happening. I can't talk about all of it in this presentation. I'm just going to talk about hip-hop in particular, but it's symptomatic of a much wider sea change that's underway. And like I live and work out in sort of Silicon Valley, and you get people who are like Rails developers or whatever else, and they kind of like look down their nose at PHP, and I think that's not. I think that's unfair. I think that's wrong. I think PHP is having a strong comeback. So let's talk about the need for speed. Who here wants their website to be faster? Everybody, right? And that's not surprising because the speed of your website influences the SEO ranking. Google tracks for speed. The speed also influences how your users respond. If you can make your website respond a second faster, whatever you're trying to do with the website, whether that's selling things to people, convincing them of something, or getting them to sign up for something, the rate of conversion is going to go up. And that's actually, statistically, there's been like neat studies on, I think Amazon released a big thing where they sped up their homepage by like 1/10 of a second, and it increased their conversion rate by a non-trivial amount, like something like 4 or 5%, which is awesome, right? So speed matters. It's really important. And as an end user, you can understand that. Like a slow website is a website you will not visit often. A slow website is one that you will click away from to look for an alternative source. The fastest website generally wins. And that's why this is a key thing. Performance is really a full-stack challenge because it actually, to get the end user to have a speedy experience, requires you to have a good front end, an optimized front end. It requires you to have stuff that's well cached and everything else. It requires you to not be abusing your database and running crazy queries. And it helps if you have a very efficient runtime. And so I'm focusing on the runtime, the sort of the engine of PHP in this talk, because that's where hip hop matters. But I don't want to give a misperception that this is somehow like, well, the results are dramatic and are legit, and this is something you should all pay attention to if you care about it. It's not like this solves the problem of performance. It's more a very important thing to be considering if you care about this sort of stuff. So cache rules everything around you if you care about performance, from the L2 bus cache on the server to the cache in the browser. There's a bunch in between, and they're all really important. As I saw a talk by the guy who's the creator of Varnish, Paul Henning-Camp, who's kind of a character. If you ever get a chance to see him talk, do it. It's an amazing presenter, and a lot of like interesting stories. But he said he likes to say, it's just caches all the way down, and you got to be aware of that. So I'm not going to talk about caching in this talk, but it's very important. The front end is, I think, the frontier for really delivering breakthrough performance, because at the end of the day, no matter how fast the application or the server responds, if it doesn't render quickly, the user doesn't care. And I see a lot of times where people will spend money on expensive hardware, and they'll spend hours of engineering time optimizing their queries and getting their back end in order, but then their front end is like still, the CSS isn't compressed and aggregated, and they're like, they're basically allowing the page to block on loading images and other things like that you don't need to do anymore. And as a result, their end user experience is still suffering. So the front end, if it's not right, it doesn't matter. And there's a lot of exciting stuff happening with front end performance. So I think it's a very, very cool field. I won't be talking about front end performance at all. And if you want to talk about things that make your website slow, as in will totally bring it to a grinding halt and crash it, SQL is still the king of nonlinear performance degradation. This is like if you get like a bunch of traffic and you've got some code that's like, maybe it's doing something suboptimally, like it's sorting through an array in a way that could be better, like you're generally going to see performance go down in direct proportion to the amount of traffic. If you have a query of death is lurking in your site somewhere, where it's a terrible query that requires creating a giant temporary table and doing a file sort, you will see the website performance just like fall off a cliff. And so this is still the kind of like the thing. Like if you're not aware of what you're doing with your database, you're running the risk of essentially running into the Titanic, and the iceberg is out there. So be aware. I'm not talking about SQL performance in this, but be aware. I'm talking about PHP engine performance. So this is the internals of how your website gets served when the request comes in. What is the code actually doing to get the response? That's what PHP does, and that's what hip hop replaces. Do you guys know much about hip hop? A little bit? Okay. So a little history. I actually met one of the main developers last weekend in LA and learned some nice tidbits. So Facebook doubled down on PHP. They said, we're going to do it. We're going to stick with PHP. And then they started doing their long-term planning and figured out how many servers they would need to buy and how many data centers they would need to build to grow Facebook to a global audience. They had, I don't know how well they've met or broken those projections, but basically they were looking at a huge capital expenditure to go from a couple 100 million users to like they have a target of over 1 billion, right? And they're like, well, we're sticking with the horse that we're riding, but we're going to have to build. They did, and they are like literally building data centers to run their application. And they said, well, come on, maybe we should think about let's just totally think outside the box. What could we do to make it so that we could, get better performance out of our application? And they came up with the hip hop compiler, which is the sort of precursor. And they actually called it HPPHP, High Performance PHP. And then it turns out when they wanted to release this, that PHP doesn't let you use PHP in the trademark to protect, make it clear what PHP is and isn't. So HPPHP turned into hip hop. And what it did was it would take your PHP application and reverse machine generate it into C code, and then build the binary that resulted from the C code and let you ship that out and deploy it as a functioning binary and not a just-in-time interpreted script. And it worked. This is the crazy thing, is that it totally worked for Facebook they were able to ultimately quintuple the density of their application instances in their existing data centers. Or to put it another way, they built one data center instead of 5. So this is like the ultimate in green technology. And it paid off for them like financially, hugely. Obviously, 5 data centers is pretty expensive. So really good investment. They wanted to contribute it back. Part of their whole like we're doubling down on PHP is that we need to like put more energy into the open source ecosystem because it'll pay off for us in the long run too. The problem was that HipHop, the compiler, was like it takes a long time. Like I ran some tests when they first released it. It took like 45 minutes to compile Drupal. Some things didn't work, and the resulting binary from compiling Drupal was over 1.2 gigabytes. Right, because it's actually taking apart your PHP, generating the C code that it would have done automatically. So it's like the ugliest code imaginable, and then compiling it. And so it worked. Like we were able to get there were some problems with like session handling, I think was the issue at the time. We were able to get it to work, and I could see that it was definitely faster. It was definitely more memory friendly, and you can imagine how like if you're really trying to pack the processes in, this would be a good thing. But it's totally impractical, right? I can't do a 45-minute compile every time I add a module, right? That's not a really workable use case. And people thought, well, maybe you could just compile the core and still use modules. And they were thinking, well, maybe we can allow you to have a slug in an application and you can still load libraries. And they ended up throwing out that concept. They went back and they were having it internally. It was still like it was a pain because what they had was because of the compile step, and the compiling was nice for deployments, but it's bad for development. And all their internal developers were still basically just using PHP. And then they started running into problems where developing in PHP, but then compiling to HipHop to deploy, there would be unexpected behavior in the results of the compiled application. Developers like, well, that's your fault, and the sysadmins are like, no, you should have been testing the compile on your end. Bad times, or not, the trouble. And so they went back to the drawing board and they said, well, now that we have this process for doing compilation, there's an awful lot of computer science that's been built up in the Java world around this idea of just-in-time compilation. That's kind of how Java works, right? It's you don't have to recompile everything inside your Java virtual machine. It'll just-in-time compile it. And so they said, what if we could use the concepts of just-in-time compiling and our algorithm for reverse engineering PHP into C code, put those together and create a HipHop just-in-time compiled virtual machine? And that's what HHVM is. It's what they use internally. They basically have rewritten PHP now from scratch. And they are documenting it, which was never done before. So there's now a spec for PHP produced largely by Facebook, which is another big win. And they have their own sort of variant of PHP that they call Hack, which is PHP with strong typing. So basically you can say this can only be an integer, or this can only be an array. And that like helps like enforce regularity, and it also increases performance because you don't have to guess at everything. And again, saved 5 data centers from being built. So that's pretty awesome. What does that mean for you? Well, because it's just-in-time compiled and because you basically can throw in your PHP code and run it, it's now kind of feels like it could be a workable solution for running Drupal sites or WordPress sites. And it turns out that it is. So I set this up on Pantheon and tested it. My test was using Panoply, which is a distribution that we help maintain. It's a pretty fat distribution. It's got over 100 modules, including some things that people say have negative implications for performance, like panels. I actually don't think panels is bad for performance, but panels lets you do something like stick 10 views on a page, and running 10 views can be not performant dependent. But it's essentially it's a good case for HipHop because this is a big Drupal build with a lot of modules. There's a lot of code to execute. So we should see the results of executing code more efficiently in our performance measurement. And I just basically turned off all caching, bypassed everything. So basically to make it as slow as possible, not as slow as possible, to make sure that we're actually measuring engine performance. So every page request is generated dynamically. There's no caching involved. And I did the test with PHP 5.3, which is currently kind of the standard in Drupal 7 land. I also tested with PHP 5.5, which we're running on the platform for some sites, and we'll be making available to everybody soon. And then I ran against HipHop Virtual Machine. So you can see in the test results some of the improvements from just upgrading PHP to the most modern version, and then from HipHop. Yes, question?
I'm not sure I understand. I'm not a Drupal person, but is Monopoly like a Drupal thing? Or is that like on the Linux something?
It's a Drupal thing. So Drupal has. I apologize. The slides here are from. I gave this presentation last week at a Drupal event, so I shouldn't assume that people know this stuff. So Drupal. Do you know what web framework do you like to work with?
Laravel and WordPress.
Okay, so Laravel and WordPress. So I don't know about Laravel, but WordPress has plugins. And Panoply is essentially a suite of plugins that are sort of put together in a way that will produce a really nice end result. I can actually show you real quick in our. So like this is the site that I tested against, and so like if you've installed vanilla Drupal, it looks nothing like this. And the neat thing about Panoply is it has it's down. I'll fix this in a second. But basically, like you're getting a lot of stuff here that doesn't come with Drupal by default. It's sort of like a distribution is what they tend to call it, built on top of Drupal. And so it's not just like we're exercising, vanilla Drupal core, which nobody really uses. This is kind of roughly simulates what you would end up running to build a real website. Okay, and the test here, AB-C5N1000, is good old Apache Bench, simulating 5 concurrent requesters making 1,000 requests. That was sort of the benchmark that we used. Okay, and the results. I was going to demo, just so you can see what it looks like to run this benchmark. So I am going to just restart this thing. This is like coloring outside the lines on Pantheon. And this should be working now. We hope. Yep. Okay. So like this kind of like drag and droppy stuff is not usually like included in Drupal by default. This is one of the things that Panoply delivers. It's pretty neat. If you want to try out Drupal, it's a cool build. And I have over here on my test server. I'm going to do the same thing, but I'm going to just limit it to 200 requests, or 250, so it can be faster. And you can see the. This is just going to simulate a bunch of requests. And there it did 100. It's not in the background. It's just hammering that side. There's 200. So this is it's like getting started. So the first request was very long, but then it's all kind of like warmed up and they get much faster. I tested the benchmark was against a warm site, not a cold site. So that was the benchmark that we did against all those things, and the results, which is sort of the punchline of this whole presentation, were pretty dang good. All right. So here's PHP 5.3 with APC and with all the tuning and on Pantheon, so that's like basically as good as it gets for PHP 5.3. And on a warm site, I was able to push a little over 11 requests per second, and the 98th percentile response time, meaning 98% of those requests came back within 509 milliseconds, which is pretty good. That's like half a second for an uncached page. That's legit, right? We're not like dragging there, but it could be faster, right? So this is what you get today if you just run something on Pantheon. It's actually gotten a little bit faster because of some other optimizations we've done, but I did these benchmarks in the summer. So then we upgraded to PHP 5.5 with the new opcode cache, and we saw a noticeable increase. So we were able to push a little bit more than 14 requests per second, and we got the response back in about a tenth of a second faster. That's a real performance increase. That's a real win right there, just by upgrading to the most recent version of PHP. And this is what I mean by there's the broader PHP renaissance. This is like PHP core is really getting its act together, which is great. And the response time is exactly where we would expect to see it. This is a New Relic snapshot that I took when I ran some of these tests. And so you can see that the time spent in the database, represented in the yellow, is unchanged between the two tests. So basically, first wave, I toggled the second wave. All of the performance increase comes in this blue area, which New Relic is measuring as time spent in PHP. So like PHP thinking about what it's going to do took 22% less time by upgrading to PHP 5.5. That's a real win. It's very, very good to see. There is no New Relic support yet for hip-hop, so I don't have the equivalent graph, but I do have the end results of the test, and it was pretty good. Got up to 21.5 requests per second, and 98% of those requests were coming back in under a third of a second. So we went from half a second to a third of a second, that's noticeable by the end user. A 200 millisecond performance increase is definitely, people are going to feel that. there will be a tactile difference in working with a web page that is that quick versus something that takes 1 to 2 seconds to load. And that's on Hip Hop Virtual Machine 3.1, and they're going to be 3.3 this fall, which is their kind of like, I guess they're making that a big release. So I would expect to see this improve somewhat even further as they begin to improve. I would also expect PHP 7, not PHP 6, but PHP 7 to start to rival these numbers as well. So we can expect great things to come from performance in the future. And if you want to break it down like this is the one that you care about, right? So if your website needs to be faster, right? This is, now like sort of standard long-term edition of PHP, most recent version of PHP, and hip hop, right? It's almost twice as fast, and that's legit. The one that I care about and the one that Facebook cares about most is scale, right? What I can do as a platform is I can run a lot more applications on the same hardware if I get everybody using this, which is why I'm trying to get people excited about it. It's going to make your websites faster. It's going to make my life easier, and I'm very excited to see these things. The other cool things that are possible because of the Hip Hops project is it is a persistent daemonized process. So if you want to do something like use React PHP to do real-time kind of stuff, Hip Hop makes that possible. You could. So I'm actually working on a demo that will do the sort of like front-end push notification stuff that people like to do with JavaScript, like with Socket.io, but using React, PHP, and Hip Hop rather than a separate node server. So it can all be one application, all running under one virtual machine, and you can build fast, modern, awesome web experiences. So it's going to be a new day. That is the hashtag PHP Renaissance. And I'm just going to conclude by reiterating that performance is incredibly important, but it is a full stack challenge. You have to get into all these things if you really want to be, deliver heroic results. But I invite you to dig in because it's a fun place to work and it's a really important problem to be able to solve. And that's the talk. That's what I got. Thank you for listening. I'm happy to take any questions, or we can take it outside or offline elsewhere. Yes.
One of the reasons people always say you have to run PHP and its own process is this idea that there are memories.
Mm-hmm.
How does the VM work with that?
So there are memory leaks. PHP 5.3 largely does away with most of them. So here's the deal. You can put memory leaks in your application code really easily without intending to, and you kind of be careful about that if you're running long, persistent processes. Like we had a memory leak in our dashboard application just last week, and like it's not that there's a language that is going to make it impossible for you to have memory leaks. However, prior to PHP 5.5, and well, PHP 5.3 it was edgy, but it was still there. There were just fundamental language features of PHP that leaked memory, meaning that it would not clean up its own garbage reliably, and you could just sit there and iterate through an array over and over again and watch the memory utilization climb over time, which basically means that you can't run it persistently. And that's just legacy feature of where the language came from. It was assumed that you would be setting up and discarding the whole process for every page load, and it was a paradigm that's very like Web 1.0. Like I want that page, give me that page, shut the application down, and boot it back up again when I want another page. So that's not very performant, and it prevents you from doing anything real time. But it also lets you be lazy about a bunch of other stuff, which PHP was. Now with PHP 5.4 and 5.5. Like I skipped 5.4 because it's sort of a jump the chump. 5.4 added a bunch of language features like name spacing. It also cleaned up the last of these known issues just internal to PHP that would cause memory leakage. So you can do a persistent PHP process in 5.5 and feel a lot better about PHP not leaking memory. You still need to think about your application leaking memory because it's really easy to if you're a really common one is you open file descriptors and you don't close them, or you open curl sessions and you don't destroy them. Things like that will, over time, maybe it takes like a couple weeks to get bad, but then all of a sudden, why is my system running out of memory? Or why is that taking so much memory? Oh God, restart it. And then typically the pattern is you restart it and the problem goes away and you kind of forget about it until it gets big again, and then there's a whole process for dealing with this. But yes, hip hop, to specifically answer your question, isn't PHP. That's the important thing to remember. It's actually a complete rewrite. and it doesn't support everything in PHP. They have a goal that they're largely hitting and will be doing better with the 3.3 release. I think that's one of the things that's coming out of that, of supporting the top 20 PHP web frameworks out of the box natively, and Drupal does work. As you can see, I didn't actually demonstrate that for you guys. This site here that I'm looking at, this is running in HipHop right now. If I go to my info.php, it just says HipHop. And that's, I swear that's actually a PHP info file. I'll show you. Nothing up my sleeves. In the code directory, info. Oops. Yeah, there you go. PHP info, it just says HipHop. They're going to eventually fix this, but priorities, right? So, so it works now. There are edge cases, though. And we can't guarantee that every site is going to work under HipHop, and it's probably got a little ways to go in terms of stability. But because it's a ground-up rewrite and it's using this new virtual machine just-in-time compiled framework, and internally it's sort of supporting their own variant of PHP, they feel really good about its inherent stability. Your application code is still your responsibility, though.
That sort of brings me to my question, which is, we took a Drupal 6 site, put it on PHP 5.3, and a little bit of core doesn't work.
Yep.
Is there some way of static analyzing all the 20,000 modules that are sitting out there for their compatibility with these various?
You know, that's a good question. I'm sure that there is a way to do that. I saw Sarah, who works at Facebook, present on some of the internal tools that they use. That she gave, her talk was like inside HipHop Virtual Machine, and mine is just like how you can use it for websites and how much faster it is. And they have a thing that they do internally at Facebook where you can toggle it into different modes where it will tolerate more sloppiness or older stuff. And yeah, kind of like that. And then what you can do is it'll actually, it seems really neat. I haven't had a chance to play with it. But basically, it'll help you build up a log file over time of the things that you may want to examine. And then they're using it internally to transition things from pure, or rather native PHP to Hack, which is a little bit much more strict. But I think it could work for PHP as well. However, things like the stuff from Drupal 6 that breaks under 5.3 or modules there are not going to be supported, because it is about, like, all this is possible because we're leaving some legacy behind.
I think you almost have to do static code analysis, because in theory, I mean, put views on any typical site, you're going to execute 10% of views code.
Right.
So looking at logs and seeing where it's broken isn't going to tell you that somewhere in the other 80% are 4 really fatal bugs that when your next site comes up.
Yeah.
So
that would be.
There's got to be some kind of static analysis that says, yeah, this could be a problem you might want to look at.
Yeah, that would be definitely something to look at. It would be good. Right now, my suggestion. Well, what I hope I can contribute to that equation is by allowing people to really easily try out these different variations on my platform for free and kind of gather anecdotal evidence. But it would be a great project for somebody to go and like try to produce a report.
To be very honest, I've never checked my module in the PHP version.
Yeah, well, hey, but you're doing good work. Giving it away, other people should help out with that. Okay, you had a question.
Yeah, so Hack, PHP 7,
yeah.
What's their dance together?
So Hack is not PHP. It is open source, and it is openly specified, but it's doing things that PHP will never do. So, and in particular, it is encouraging you and allowing you to strongly type your data. And so that's not something that PHP 7 will support. PHP 7 is going to have a bunch of fun things in it, and it's going to have, it looks like it's going to have some performance improvements that are going to rival hip-hop. And what I'm hoping is that they just kind of continue to push one another to like get better and better, and that's what's going to happen. But I would imagine that, again, the idea will be most code will be portable, but Hack is actually, its future trajectory is to be a different language than PHP with a different set of assumptions. And just, basically the HHVM will allow you to run Hack and PHP code side by side as part of your project.
And is Hack going to be open source?
It is, yeah. And you can check it out. You can check it out now. You can build it, although that takes a long time. But they have like a nice documentation site for it, and you can run it in HHVM. inside of HHVM if you want to try to build something with it. If you're a PHP developer, it's kind of cool. There's some neat language functions for sure. Yes, and then yes.
What's the process for getting Drupal to run in HHVM? You just type a command and it compiles it for you? Or?
Well, that's the beauty of it, is that so HHVM kind of replaces your web server, like it replaces Apache too. And the way that it works is you configure it. It's really easy. It's not super well documented yet, but it's actually not that hard to get going. So like I think I've got hhvm.conf. And so this basically just says, right, where's the error log, where's the access log? Oh, here we go. So this is basically you just, set it up, point it at your code base, tell it that the default document is index.php, and then there's some tunables, and then it runs. HHVM is a server daemon. It listens on a port, or you can run it under fastcgi with like Nginx in front of it, which is actually what we're doing here. And that's it. It's actually, once this gets a little bit more mature and a little bit more baked, we'll release a how-to if you want to set this up on your own. But there's actually decent documentation for. I cribbed some of my stuff from somebody put up a thing for like running WordPress in it, and it's just a matter of configuring you can install it from, like, if you have a modern Ubuntu or a modern CentOS or Fedora system, you can install it from a package manager and just set it up and run it, and it probably totally works. Probably totally. Yes, you had a question there. You got your hand up earlier.
Oh yeah, I was. Don't worry about
it. Okay. Yeah.
So you said that the first page will be kind of slow, but once it's warmed up, it's faster.
Yep.
If you're not caching anything, where's this warmed up stuff coming from?
So that's the just-in-time compiler. As the code is exercised, so like the first bootstrap is the hardest because it actually has to read the code files off the disk, right? So there's when I say I turned caching off, I mean like Drupal's internal caching, and like there's no varnish in front of it or anything like that. But like it's caches all the way down. So inside the kernel, there's the page cache, and there's also a cache in the file system of recently read files. So in a totally cold system, you're making a request into the running hip-hop daemon. It needs to access the physical disk to read the files, and then it does its first just-in-time compile pass against them. And that first request is relatively slow because it actually is accessing. Even if it's an SSD, it's still way slower than if the code is already in memory. Subsequently, it actually gets even faster as you exercise the site because it's constantly optimizing. It actually will. This is the sort of where all the computer science has been done in the Java world, but the patterns and algorithms are applicable elsewhere. As the application runs and is exercised, the just-in-time compiler will continue to optimize. So what I saw over time was obviously the first request was slow, it was cold, and then it got a little bit better. I mean, the thing is that if I'm just hitting the home page and doing the same thing over and over again, it's not exercising different functions, different features, as you were talking about, different areas of the code, so the optimization happens pretty quick. But on a dynamic website with like a lot of different modules and lots of different sort of patterns of use, I would expect that like for the first hour it would keep speeding up a little bit. But it's really the difference between that first request where it has to read the code and then subsequent requests when it's just running.
That's for hip-hop. For the traditional PHP, is there SOE APC?
Yeah, so and that's where APC in this test here, APC is replaced in PHP 5.5 by opcode, and it's built into PHP core. It's not an additional module or module that you need to install. So you just enable it, and it's better than APC. It's less buggy and it's a little bit faster. But it's the same thing. That's as an opcode cache. You start out, that cache is empty, and the PHP needs to read and compile the files, probably reading them off of the disk, and then it sort of stuffs that into the opcode cache, so it doesn't ever have to do that again. Similar kind of performance penalties to the first request, as you would see with hip-hop. But ideally, that first request, it's just one out of hopefully thousands, and then the rest of them are speedy.
And MySQL query cache, is that another cache that we didn't turn off?
The query cache is definitely enabled by default. So that's why the database time here is unchanged, though, between the versions. It's orthogonal, right? That's another layer that that doesn't get hit that hard. The other thing is the site that I'm demoing against doesn't have a lot of content in it, so it's almost impossible for it to have a slow query because there are only like 20 nodes. And that if you were doing the queries dynamically versus the cache, it would very marginally affect the response time. For bigger, the query cache is actually not as big a win as people think. It typically doesn't. There's so many things that aren't covered by the query cache. So many things invalidate it very quickly. And the truth is that you're an optimized query on modern hardware and a good CPU is going to execute almost as fast anyway. It's really that the query cache can kind of cover for, so if you have something that's query cacheable and it's a query of death, then you can get around it. But it's actually really bad because the query cache gets invalidated all the time, and like you're going to have it's an unspecified and uncontrollable time. The query of death will rear its ugly head again, and your site may go down. So it's I'm not a huge fan of the query cache.
How does Hip-Hopium work with multi-cores?
Very well, in fact. So the you saw in here one of it's thread counts, so like threading for real, natively, nice. So yeah, for modern servers, right, you're not dealing with a single processor. You're dealing with multiple processors, and they engineered it to do that just kind of the right way, natively, out of the box. You don't have to like try to do something where you're spinning up multiple processes and trying to balance across them or anything like that. So it's definitely a win from that perspective, and that's part of the reason why you get the better throughput here, right? This is why if you look at the benefit on requests per second, the throughput is much higher than you would expect from just the speed. It's not just that it's doing more requests; it's actually distributing them better across the system so that it can parallelize better. Any more? All right, thank you very much. Google Hangouts.